Hey, what's up, everybody? My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this, for better or worse, is the New Movie Diary, in which I review recent, new, and up-and-coming film releases and attempt to give you the straight facts about them, in my humble opinion. So between Blue Beetle and Strays, it's been kind of a slow week for me as far as mainstream releases go, but luckily we've got two keenly anticipated limited art house and independent releases also having premiered last Thursday, when I double featured both of them. On the one hand, we've got REBIRTH, the eagerly awaited feature directorial debut by Laura Moss, a very promising filmmaker who first made a big festival splash with her short film Friday all the way back in 2017, and is now coming at us with a very interesting new horror film co-written with frequent collaborator Brendan J. O'Brien and is being touted by IFC Films. And then on the other end, The Adults, starring Michael Cera, Hannah Gross, and Sophia Lillis. This one is written and directed by one Dustin Guy Difa, another very impressive filmmaker with quite a resume of challenging feature and short subjects going all the way back to 2011. Let's go ahead and jump into things with REBIRTH, which has been being touted as something of a novel twist on the Frankenstein formula, but I honestly think it bears much more narrative and even something of a tonal, if not an aesthetic, resemblance to Stuart Gordon's Reanimator. Then again, Reanimator itself owes no small amount of debt to Frankenstein. Any piece of popular culture about reanimating the dead is going to, but there's definitely something about the very offbeat sense of humor to REBIRTH, the sort of downplayed absurdism and lack of strict adherence to a sense of motivational logic and cinematic naturalism and Gross and O'Brien's script definitely reminds me very vividly of Reanimator in that respect, but then again, I could just be responding very vividly to Marin Ireland's starring performance as our Mad Doctor here in question. It's not like it's a copycat or an homage, but there's definitely something about her own understated, rather deadpan channeling of this film's very dark sense of humor that, to me at least, felt very spiritually indebted, whether consciously or not, to Jeffrey Combs in Reanimator. But just to get a basic sense of the plot out of the way, Marin Ireland is playing Rose, a severely neuroatypical pathologist working as a morgue technician who is experimenting with reanimating the dead on the one side, and then it also co-stars Judy Reyes, who I still primarily associate with her most iconic role as the nurse Carla from Scrubs, here also playing a nurse, which is just a bit too on the nose that I hope there wasn't really any element of stunt casting involved in this. But anyway, Reyes is playing Celie, a nurse and single mother whose 6-year-old daughter, Leela, AJ Lister, suddenly passes away from a case of fungal meningitis. The desperately eager Rose, whose methods for reanimating the dead involves regularly feeding the recently deceased with a concoction derived from fetal and placental tissue, receives Leela's body, realizes that she and her are virtually perfect genetic matches, and thus abducts the body with the plan to make it her first human test subject for her experiments. It's far from a perfectly executed plan. Celie easily deduces that Rose is lying when she claims Leela's body was already claimed by the city and that she doesn't know where it is. Celie ends up stalking Rose back to her apartment, forces her way in, and of course discovers Leela, now comatose but alive, in a medical ward that Rose has set up in her apartment. From there, from this sudden revelation, we actually leap forward fairly significantly in time. REBIRTH definitely has a very idiosyncratic narrative structure and a sense of pace, though idiosyncratic or unorthodox is one way to put it. Another way might be a tad bit annoying, because basically before we even know it, it's 10 weeks later, and basically Celie has moved into Rose's apartment and is basically acting as her nurse and assistant, stealing medical supplies and organic materials from the hospital she works at when necessary, and And basically the tone that ends up being set by this flash forward in time, by this arrangement between Celie and Rose, is this really ironically cozy one. It very much seems as though in writing the screenplay, Moss and O'Brien have kind of struck for the idea of this situation being a kind of blackly comic, ironic twist on a sitcom premise. Even the dialogue feels quite affected and sitcom-esque at times. But the way Moss directs it, it ends up being played off in this very detached and deadpan way that ends up being contrasted with the very grim direction into which the story descends as Leela's physical condition continues to improve, but she keeps requiring regular infusions of this genetic material, which it turns out that Rose can only derive from her being such a perfect genetic match from literally impregnating herself with semen that she collects from random men and then self-terminating the fetus at 10 weeks. She's apparently been doing this for quite a long time, even in anticipation of ever having a human test subject. Because by the time she aborts this fetus that she actually conceived right before ever discovering Leela or meeting Celie, by this time she contracts a severe cervical infection that requires surgery, and she's now unable to conceive. She insists that Celie is not enough of a proper match to do this herself, and so basically this precipitates an escalation in the story as they realize that they will soon not have enough material to sustain the progress of Leela's ongoing regeneration, which will require them to engage in a lot more drastic action in order to find a substitute, i.e., basically finding another unwitting donor of sorts for their experiments. You know, it's very interesting. It was just last week that I was talking about Meg 2, The Trench of all things, and calling attention to it as an example of a film that doesn't really go far enough in taking an absurd concept and playing it straight for better comedic effect. And I think with Birth, Rebirth, I've discovered a perfect candidate where precisely the thing that I said the Meg movies should be doing is attempted, but I still think is almost entirely miscalculated, because as dark as Birth, Rebirth gets, and as seriously as it plays with its character drama, especially how seriously it takes the fear of invasive procedure as it regards the treatment of pregnant women, there's this really nice character moment early on before any of the inciting action where Celie is assisting at a delivery, and this doctor leading the procedure is very distant, very cold. He's not even photographed in the scene, which is another really nice touch to it, but he's entirely prepared to create a vaginal incision without even consulting the mother, and Celie is able to intervene and get the now very passive-aggressive doctor to give the mother another chance to deliver the baby on her own. There are actually lots of nice little touches throughout Birth, Rebirth that play very seriously with that idea of medical threat, of medical invasion, of the way that sort of institutional sexism affects quality of care, and then from an allegorical perspective, how Celie becomes increasingly willing to manipulate and invade the autonomy of other women in order to get her daughter back, in order to pursue her own utilitarian medical motives. But the thing is that Birth, Rebirth only really starts getting good once it reaches that point where simply keeping Leela regenerating becomes the driving focus of the plot. Whereas I think a major stumbling block of this film is that the inciting action feels very forced, and I'm not talking about Rose stealing Leela's body really without a plan. That's just typical Mad Doctor stuff, and she's got to make that impulsive decision or else we don't have a movie. I'm not quite sure about the genetic or medical rationale of why it needs to be her fetal and placental material, but I don't know enough about that to really make a judgment about the accuracy of the speculative fiction that O'Brien and Moss are engaging in. I'm talking totally about Celie's insinuated motivation to now become fully participant in the effort to revive her daughter, which, let's be clear here, occurs almost immediately after literally forcing her way into Rose's apartment and seeing her previously thought daughter's cadaver in a strange adult's apartment. And then we quite literally flash to 10 weeks later, and everything's like, again, this kind of strange sitcom situation where Rose is like the classical monomaniacal mad doctor, but who is presented as very emotionally distant, very lacking in a sense of humor or irony, very androgynous in her presentation, almost like the straight man or absent paternal figure. And then there's Seeley as this more classical, nurturing maternal figure who's completing the unorthodox family structure that's required to really raise this child, not just raise the child, but, literally raise her from the grave. Basically, Moss and O'Brien make the decision to almost completely paper over how we get from Seeley discovering her daughter's, at the very least, unconscious body in a strange woman's house to her being the ball and chain of this odd couple scenario. And I just don't think that the film ends up earning it. There's not enough that we learn about Seeley's previous characterization that justifies it or makes it feel coherent or natural, even within what turns out to be the kind of deadpan black comedy of the overall film. Because it's one thing to take something absurd and play it straight for comedic effect, but it's another thing to basically write out all emotional impulsivity from a character. Like, Seeley should at least have had a moment to really freak out. Even if she's stunned to see her daughter alive, she should be more stunned by the circumstances of it and who should be the target of those circumstances. It's one thing to do something absurd and play it straight. It's another thing to do something that is just kind of stupid and asynchronous with just about any person's basic reactive tendencies to extraordinary situations and play it so straight that what ends up happening is that Birth Rebirth gets set up on a path where it's treading a line where it takes a minute to correctly infer that it even is doing something tongue-in-cheek. And look, there's plenty of horror movies with stupid exposition and with a very hands-off, to put it that way, of looking at how you get the characters you need to get up to the sorts of grim predicaments that they do. And quite frankly, with Reanimator as a point of comparison, that's a perfect example. It's a very absurd movie with not a lot of serious investment in the logic of characters' actions. And I'm not even precisely saying that I wish Moss had directed Birth Rebirth with more of an operatic tendency like Stuart Gordon, but I do think that there is just something really woefully underdeveloped just about the basic line that the movie rides, where it begins rather straightforwardly and naturalistically with Seeley's story, is rather shockingly and blackly comic with Rose's story, but then when these two paths cross, suddenly gets very dramatically serious and emotionally ponderous with its body horror, and then also suddenly a switch is flipped to sitcom stuff. I just think maybe the best way of saying it is just the old cliche. It was all over the place. It was all over the place, and frankly, it was all over the place without a lot of exciting filmmaking going on. Don't get me wrong, I don't think, besides some serious reservations about the inciting action of the film, that Birth Rebirth is bad by any stretch of the imagination. It's rather well acted. Moss directs everything very well, and once it settles into its groove of body horror as a vehicle for some actually quite effective body horror of the more somber and low-key, dreadful variety, it certainly is a thoroughly watchable experience. But while the mileage may vary depending on your taste, at the end of the day, I just didn't think there was that much that was terribly exceptional about it. It's good, it's just not that good. And while there are lots of really well carried off small touches, I just don't think that on the whole that it stands out that much. And I don't think it stands out that much either as a drama or as just a grim body horror movie. I'll admit that part of my perception might simply be colored by my anticipation for this as Moss's feature debut. If you haven't seen Friday, I highly recommend seeking it out. Basically, just in that 16-minute film, it packs just as much of an emotional punch as any feature film debut, and really a lot more than the real feature film debut that Moss has here. And I don't think I'm alone in having gone into Birth Rebirth in expecting something that played more to Moss's well-established strengths, because while I tend to be of a mind that most of her previous short collaborations with O'Brien have been rather superficial, with Friday being a really key exception in that regard, she definitely has an incredible strength in terms of directing productions that have an impeccable degree of period and regional accuracy that frankly makes even someone like Robert Eggers just look like a glib dilettante in comparison. But Birth Rebirth is kind of just a situation where those strengths aren't highlighted at all, and part of that is predictable just because this is her first feature film, and who knows what O'Brien and she have waiting in the wing as far as future or sophomore projects to explore. It might simply be that for this first venture, they simply don't have the budget to do something more aesthetically challenging, more elaborate in terms of its subject matter and production quality. But then again, at the end of the day, I simply found Birth Rebirth to just kind of be both aesthetically and dramatically underwhelming on its own terms. I'm going to give this one a solid 3 out of 5. Certainly a decent body horror film and quite intelligently crafted in some regards, but at the end of the day, just not something that I found in the final analysis to be terribly exciting or to have had much even immediate staying power for me. Anyway, I did end up double featuring Birth Rebirth with the adults with the expectation that it was going to be a much mellower movie coming out of the body horror film. But if there was one thing surprising about last Thursday evening, it was the small ways that I found that not only was the adults much more affecting of a film overall, but specifically that it felt like it had such a more pronounced sense of emotional disturbance and conflicted feeling than literally the movie about a woman who aborts her own fetuses to make a serum to bring someone back from the dead. I'm not saying that this is some profoundly dark movie. It's just that going into it, I wasn't expecting much more than a sort of typical quirky indie drama. You know the type, on the more comedic side of drama than the more dramatic side of comedy. But what I got out of it was anything but. I mean, it kind of does have those aspects of being more of a quirky indie drama, more on the comedic side of drama than the other way around, but it also, in a weird way, has this quality of almost being like a scab that just gets picked so that the superficial layer of the more quirky indie comedy kind of peels back to reveal something much more festering and oozing and uncomfortable to look at. I should have probably been more prepared given the writer-director. For those unfamiliar, Dustin Gaidifa is an independent filmmaker with a really impressive body of work going back to his feature debut Bad Fever from 2011, which is this really quite dark, very low-budget character study starring Kentucker Audley, that's a name, as this severely anxiety-ridden, possibly mentally handicapped guy who dreams of becoming a comedian and ends up falling in love with his homeless woman played by Eleanor Hendricks. It's a very much a stark, caustic, neo-realistic movie, and it's also very, very good. An incredible debut, and subsequent to that, Difa mostly worked in short subjects dealing in a variety of topics, and throughout his career has really engaged consistently in rather radical changes in his aesthetic approach and the types of both real-life and fictional stories that he tackles. But before The Adults, his most recent film was Person to Person in 2017, and that actually did turn out to be something of a rather typical quirky indie comedy. This ensemble piece dealing with many different characters and their own only sometimes interweaving stories. And while I thought that was a decent film, it was certainly a mellower direction for Difa to go into that I wasn't really prepared for, given not only the nature of his debut, but also the more aesthetically and narratively radical kinds of short works he's more known for. And so in the lead up to The Adults, I was more or less expecting something like that. And while this is certainly a little more like Person to Person than it is Bad Fever, I have to say the main thing that surprised me about it was just how severe the dramatic beats ended up being, how consistently fascinated I was with the twists and turns of the narrative, and all of which ends up being anchored by none other than Michael Cera in an absolutely brilliant central performance by him. Basically, Cera is playing this guy named Eric, this estranged eldest sibling to two sisters, Rachel, played by Hannah Gross, and Maggie, played by Sophia Lillis. Eric is returning to his hometown after 3 years of almost zero contact with his sisters, and what's really great about how Difa writes and directs The Adults is this really excellently executed observation of character rather than clear exposition. Our first introduction to Eric is literally just his arriving in a hotel room and first getting a call from an old friend about coming over to visit and see his new baby, and then a call from his sister about when he's planning to show up at her house. And in both cases, he lies to both of them about having to see the other first and needing to reschedule with them, basically setting us right off with this very uncertain, even kind of creepy perspective on Sarah's character, being presented as very detached and manipulative. Eric basically tells his sisters that he only has a few hours to spend with them before he has to end up catching an early flight the next morning. It's never really revealed what he does for a living, but he's constantly making allusions to how frequently he travels and how much compensation he gets, which makes it all, of course, the more suspicious when he doesn't want to spend more time with his sisters. Rachel is far more standoffish with him than the younger Maggie is. Maggie basically idolizes him, and there seems to be a really bad blood between Rachel and Eric. But it turns out that Eric is basically more interested in spending the evening getting back together his old high school poker group for a game, and he only decides to stay an extra day when he ends up losing the poker game, and we start seeing this side of his character who really hates losing. And so he basically ends up staying an extra day so that he can play with the poker group again. And so the narrative of the adults ends up becoming this weird, increasingly tense observational study of how it's the opportunity to win at poker that keeps Eric in town and thus able to spend more time with his sisters, especially Maggie, who literally starts crying when he surprises her the next morning about having not left, but never really doing so in order to spend time with them. And just describing the plot back to myself, I'm kind of reckoning with the fact that it is kind of an incredibly dark story, probably in its own way more stark and unsettling in its character study than anything that happens in terms of body horror in Birth, Rebirth, the actual horror film. But I guess that's the thing about the adults and what's kind of so magnetic about it as a film, which is that while there is definitely this constantly threaded sense of the unsettling and the not being sure about Eric's personality, of just how estranged from his sisters he is, or just how he's capable of being this deceitful and manipulative without seeming to have any compunction about it whatsoever or any self-reflection. The way it's directed, it never really feels that dark in the moment until you finally start to think about it. So there's this two-part thing where as you're watching the movie, there are aspects of it that really get under your skin about the character, and then there's the second part where after you've watched it and you're thinking back about it, you realize how much there is still crawling under your skin just about the basic story that it's telling and the character drama it's portraying and where the story goes and what, if any, sort of catharsis you're supposed to draw from it, or the sort of catharsis you're expecting to be able to draw from it going into it, thinking of it as a more typical, quirky, indie dramatic comedy. And I think part of what's so brilliant about it is Deefa's rather ingenious ways of disarming us emotionally, of constantly showing us the rather austere, naked, unlikable qualities of the character Sarah is portraying here, but then kind of pulling us back with more eccentric sorts of things. Like, again, it's never really gone into very deeply, but there's this entire implied backstory that Eric, Rachel, and Maggie were once aspiring, like, theater people. Like, they were an aspiring performing group that Eric was apparently the leader of, and there are a bunch of moments in the film in which they will play characters they invented as kids or perform entire elaborate show tunes that they wrote as kids. And while I could understand it being rather cloying to some, I found it just so odd but also beautifully executed, and with not just, sort of a cliche, irksome quirkiness, but like a real investment in sort of implying the queer history of these three characters and how it's potentially informing their present estrangement. And with those scenes and sequences, the sheer sentimentality of it is so earnestly felt that it really does successfully disarm you, at least for a little bit, from really metabolizing just how kind of awful and Sarah's character is, which then makes it all the more brilliantly acted and directed, because this is kind of the first time Michael Cera has played a character who's like cool. And I don't mean cool as in good cool. I mean cool just in the sense that once we see Eric finally sitting down at these increasingly higher stakes poker games and being in his element where he doesn't have to put on this veneer of being terribly engaged with what his sisters or anyone else is going through and just focus on a scenario where all that matters is to win and to win big. Once we see him in these scenes, we finally get to see him sort of transform as a personality that I think a lot of people who are used to the kind of character types Sarah is used to playing, especially with his role as Alan in Barbie in the very recent Rearview, a lot of people I think are going to be caught kind of off guard by like, wow, I didn't know that Michael Cera could play a cool character. I mean, cool as a shorthand for charismatically interesting, not cool as in you want to be like him or to like him, because you definitely don't. The movie is definitely, even in its own austere way, kind of mocking Cera's character and taking him to task. There's such intensity to these moments, and it honestly gives Cera the ability to simultaneously somewhat play into a character type that he's more generally adaptable to, but in such a way where you then get to see him really inhabit a version of that character that is so much creepier and so much more pathetic than his stock nerd underling characters, but somehow more terrifyingly in control of himself and of others, and thus kind of subvert his more routine roles quite effectively. The entire cast is really good, but there's no getting around that this is Cera's film. This is an absolute revelation for him, and while there have been plenty of great performances this year, this one goes up there for me with Rachel McAdams in Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret. Even in this very calculating, bristling, but carefully self-controlled part, Cera is practically leaping off the screen here. This is definitely not a conventionally plotted film, and there are certainly some gangly aspects to its narrative structure because Deefa is very much building the story around a character who, on the one hand, is specifically trying to stay in the story, i.e. with his sisters, for as little time as possible, but then on the other hand is so impulsive that he keeps finding ways to stay longer, which requires him to invent more ways of just passing time and justifying his presence. And so there are some stretches of the adults where even as you get the sense of it's emotionally building, there are stretches of it where it just feels like it's just going absolutely nowhere. That one scene is so disconnected from another as Eric is able to so creepily compartmentalize the different worlds of his breadcrumbs of obligation to his sisters and then his true motivations and joys. But nonetheless, Deefa's writing and direction is so tightly controlled that none of it ever feels extraneous or superfluous. It all feels so essential to the building of this narrative where, again, we kind of are left to our own devices in terms of building up the background behind it, where we are kind of expected to try to think and wonder and fill in the gaps rather than having it being clearly telegraphed to us what is lying underneath all of this dysfunction and estrangement and obsession, the latter most on Eric's part especially. I'm really looking forward to more people seeing this one. It's an easy 4 out of 5 for me. Excellent third feature from Deefa, and I can't wait for more people to find out about and see it. Hey, would you look at the time? It looks like I managed to bring this double feature review in at a rather reasonable length, so why not leave on a high note, like, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia, this is Devotional Criticism, and this was the New Movie Diary. I'll catch you next time.